you have a question, perhaps if you can raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone, I'll nominate you. And if you can announce your affiliation and then your question. Thanks.
Thank you. Stephen Harmer from Lend-Lease Minister. Thanks for your insights on regulatory change. At the recent ITS conference in Melbourne, TCA announced 482 driver-facing regulations would need to be changed. Just wonder if you could comment on the regulatory change environment we're going to face for a 2026 Level 5 autonomous vehicle environment.
Yeah, look at the autonomous vehicles on our road now. There are people who are driving around in Teslas. My sense out of this, and this is one of the reasons why we converted our crash test lab into a smart innovation centre, is to make sure that we do get the regulations right. I think we are going to see, and what I don't want to see is piecemeal regulation through transition. We will have a circumstance, I believe, where we will go to partial autonomous vehicle and then full autonomous vehicles, insofar as we will still see people sitting behind the wheel of a car, even though it will be, in essence, driving itself. And then ultimately one day we'll see the abolition of the driver's licence and compulsory third-party insurance and car ownership, which I think will become subscription-based, and we will then see a very new and different environment, particularly when it comes to the management of our roadway network. It's everything from traffic lights through to roundabouts, you name it. It's a major calling on. I'm most excited about it, having experienced a head-on car accident in the bush, and the other car was doing 100 k's when it ploughed into me and my ex-wife. And you know, I can't begin to imagine what this is going to do in terms of the reduction in fatalities and the reduction in people harmed by motor vehicle accidents. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal. The pleasing thing is, well, I think we'll start to see the mass production of autonomous vehicles within 5 years. So we don't have much time. I think that the great lesson out of Uber is that there is an example of government regulation which stifled innovation for years, and then government spent 2 years trying to scratch its head as to, well, how do we deal with it? You know, well, it's disruptive. So there's the lesson. We've got to be agile, and the same goes in terms of, I'm sure it's more than 450 in New South Wales in terms of repealing regs. So that's the type of regulatory change that's going to be required, which is why Duncan Gay and I are very exercised in this at the moment.
Are there a few more questions? Yep, there's one, table 19.
Yes, thank you. Owen Hayford from Clayton Utes. My question is around the value capture. I think there's broad consensus around, the logic of the proposition, and you talked, Minister, about the special infrastructure contribution that's proposed for Parramatta Light Rail. I guess there's a lot of questions within industry as to how government proposes to go about implementing its value capture agenda on other projects going forward. Is it going to be more special infrastructure contributions, or are there other mechanisms that government is considering that that industry should start to think about?
Look, I don't think it's the type of thing which, I mean, obviously government internally looks at the principles around value capture. I mean, with the special infrastructure contribution and, administered by the Department of Planning is a form of value capture. Northwest Rail Link, government purchasing land alongside a major infrastructure project, and then after the project's complete, looking at its rezoning and moving on. I mean, these are all sensible because we've got, I think, the commencement of a metro network in this city. And we're building a 66-kilometre line at the moment from the northwest to the southwest via the city, with brand new stations at Barangaroo and Waterloo and all the city stops. And I mean, it's going to be a step change for Sydney, that project. But into the future, I mean, there has to be a question, well, how do you fund the network expansion? Ultimately, this is where it's vital. I mean, value capture is one component of the mix. There's various mechanisms of value capture, as you all know. I think it's key that if you are going to utilise it as a means to fund a project, it's got to be embedded in the business case development, and you've got to work with the development industry and the investment industry in particular, who are set to benefit, so that you make sure that you get the best results. So when it came to Parramatta Light Rail, we saw the developers and one of their lobbyists being incredibly vocal about, well, hey, we're happy to pay to play. I think that was the words Chris Brown used on the front page of one paper, you know, pay to play. So to that end, I mean, I think its broad application probably isn't going to work when it comes to infrastructure. I think you've got to look more closely at how it might spark up significant windfall gains at particular points. And that's where I think working with the investment community is key. I can tell you, I've got developers banging down on my door to want to write out cheques so that they can see infrastructure come near their development. We've got to be very careful with that, because that in itself has to fit within the long-term transport master planning and the Greater Sydney Commission planning, which is being undertaken at the moment. Canberra, the national government, of course, are very exercised in this, because ultimately, with the advent of Western Sydney Airport at Badgerys Creek, the building of the third city they see as one of the key ways forward, and the connectivity around that airport, particularly with rail, is value capture being in the mix. So to that end, I think it's vital. I think, yes, have some broad principles, don't be prescriptive, be engaging with the investment community. That's the way to go. I know one of the other states came out with their big announcement around value capture policy, but I think we've got to be very, very careful with it, absolutely. And as you know, I think the other point, I do cite North West, but those poor commuters there have been waiting generations for their infrastructure. It's a bit rough to come along and then whack on a value capture mechanism when ultimately, and by rights, that infrastructure should have been there in many ways before we saw the large-scale development that we've seen there. So it's a little bit of horses for courses in that regard. But as I said, I mean, Parramatta was made a lot easier politically because the investors were coming to us to say, hey, we want to make that significant contribution. And it's not a small contribution, it's very significant. Oh, actually, one addendum to my question. The other thing we've got to be careful of is other tiers of government. That's the other thing we've got to be conscious of. So it'd be very easy for local government to come along and whack on a value capture mechanism, state whack on a value capture mechanism, and if the feds can get their hands on a value capture mechanism, they might too. So that's another point that I needed to flag to that. And we're starting to see an example of that, so I'm mindful of that as well. Sorry.
I might exercise the chair's privilege at this point and just ask the question that a few years ago the government was talking a lot about the need to increase competition and innovation in the infrastructure markets, from the service providers to the contractors, and there seems to have been a lot of change in those markets over the last few years. Is the government seeing the benefits of the competition and the increase in innovation that it might have expected at the time?
Look, I think it's important, and we don't have the capacity within New South Wales for all our New South Wales-based contractors to do the work. So a number of years ago, a lot of international players started to circle. When you're a global sweet spot for infrastructure investment, well, all the global players want to be here. So my message to them is, as it is to all contractors, I have a very clear position that I expect every project to be delivered on time, ahead of schedule where it can be, and ahead of budget where it can be. That's my expectation. There's a lot of reputation on the line here in terms of this program. For those international players, it's great that they're here. We welcome their interest and engagement. We've got some mega projects being built at the moment. I have a very clear expectation that these projects will be delivered on time and on budget, and we've got to make sure that that's the case. So, I spend a lot of my time in project team meetings around individual projects. A lot of my week's taken up doing that. So to that end, I'm quite prepared as the state's infrastructure minister, and chief guardian of how taxpayer dollars are spent to be quite fierce in making sure my expectation and requirements are strong around that very point. So to that end, look, we're in a boom, there's no doubt about that. We've got to make sure that we deal with any capacity constraints when it comes to workforce. We have absolutely the right assurance and governance functions from within government to make sure the program's working well. So we do periodic health checks on all of our projects. One of the mega projects had a health check last week. These are the types of things that we're wanting to undertake to ensure that our program is delivered and delivered well.
Are there any more questions from the floor, or should the chair keep hectoring the minister with another question? Because I do have a few more. In your talk, you touched upon the social nature of human interaction and the fact that people are going to keep wanting to move and come together. But it does seem that despite the efforts of governments in the past to decentralise, that technology might actually drive a change in the pattern of centralisation that we've seen dominate the city. The gravity of the CBD might begin to change. What is your current thinking around the impacts of technology such as the NBN and the changing sort of patterns of commuting that might flow from that?
Well, the best example I can give of this, and it's a great point, as the member for Bega, at one point I had the Secretary of Education and the head of the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage as my local constituents. So it wasn't uncommon to see them on a Rex plane on a Thursday or a Wednesday or what have you. I think the ability to be able to telecommute is something which is really important. They're both living on the far south coast. So this is going to become more the norm than I think we've seen previously. I think regional New South Wales has a lot to offer metropolitan Sydney-siders in terms of being a great place to live and come and work because of the opening up of telecommunications. It's not 100% yet, I might add. I've got one community in my electorate, get this, doesn't have mobile phone reception but has the NBN. And I know this because this is where my parents-in-law live, so it's easier to send an email than make a phone call. So that's the type of challenge that can exist in parts of country New South Wales. But I think overall, if you look at the way in which the city is going to grow, the work that's being undertaken through Rob Stokes and Lucy Turnbull around the Greater Sydney Commission, with obviously Sydney in three segments in terms of the global CBD, the advent of central Sydney, that being the GPOP, the Greater Parramatta and Peninsula area, and then of course what will happen out in the Greater West with the regional, the international airport. It's going to, I think, require connectivity, not only in terms of a hard infrastructure sense, but also how our telecommunications network works, and then, of course, beyond that, of course, the great regions which are out there, and that's the challenge, and that's where I think ultimately the changes that will be brought to bear through telecommuting are very real and very, very profound. But coming back to your point, we're creatures of habit and we do like to socialise, so people will be forever on the move.
I'd like to invite Colin from GHD to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.